Welcome, Jake, to Obviously the Future. Thank you so much for being here today. Jake, for those who don't know him, is a multifaceted professional who recently left LinkedIn after a 7-year career working on workforce development and skills. His career spans many different fields from international criminal law, property law, global health, software development, entrepreneurship, and education. He's particularly passionate about building public and private partnerships to fight inequality. Jake has lived all over the world and has been brought up in countries like Mexico, India, Washington, D.C., and Israel. Jake is one of our most trusted advisors and network partners at Avalanche. I'm thrilled to chat with him today. I think we're all going to learn a lot. Welcome to the pod, Jake.
Thank you so very much, Caitlin. It is an absolute pleasure to be here. Avalanche has been an inspiration for me in terms of how one can both create a positive impact and make money at the intersection of tech and education. I couldn't be happier to be speaking with you about it. Thanks for
Thank you so much. I'd love to start with a little bit about your background and unique perspective. Can you tell us about your upbringing? You're Canadian, but really a kind of a global citizen. How do you see the world? What brought you to where you are today?
It's a great question, and the two are super closely linked. My background growing up both in the developing world and sort of bouncing back and forth between a life of relative affluence in poor countries and a life of being middle class in developed countries helped drive a lot of my motivations behind the work that I continue to do. Maybe I'll tell a couple of the stories of my childhood to illustrate what I just described. When I was 6 months old, having been born just outside of Ottawa, but actually on the Quebec side, so in the French language speaking portion of Canada, because it was cheaper to live there. My mother was an artist at the time, literally in the sort of classic starving potter sense. And my dad was a very junior civil servant and diplomat. 6 months later, we moved to Mexico City. And I have these probably pre-memories that have been seeded by photos of my parents of being strapped to their backs and climbing around the mountains of Mexico as a very young child. My first words were in Spanish. And so almost right away, I was beginning to get perspectives on what the world looked like. By the time I was 6 and we moved back from Ottawa, which we had moved to after Mexico, to New Delhi, one of the funny experiences there is my parents had to explain to my brother, who was 4, and I at 6, the difference between an American Indian and somebody who lived in India. And that was a really important difference to clarify before we got off the plane in a country where even the smell, every time I get off a plane in New Delhi, it brings back a flood of memories of a country that is different in almost every sense of the senses, and which I am basically addicted to because of the sort of quantity of stimulation that it provides. But
Mm.
being in India as a kid, after school at the American Embassy School, where my mom worked and my brother and I studied, we would go across the street and start pulling out lice from the hair of kids in the slums that surrounded the school as volunteer work. For a 7 or 8 year old, that was really impressionable, seeing people living in a state that was so different from ours, where we had a cook and a driver and people to take care of my brother and I, et cetera. That contrast was really impressive. Like it has driven the vast majority of my continuing work on fighting inequality through various means. I'll jump all the way to sort of finishing school, because when I did finish school, the first link that that made was to how I could take my parents' experience and leverage it to help the world. I started out tied too directly to the actual things that they did. So as an example, I went to law school like my dad, and I tried to work in international criminal law. He had been a public international lawyer with the Canadian government involved in creating the International Criminal Court. And I, at law school, had ended up working on a bunch of tribunals around the world, from helping judges with Charles Taylor's prosecution in Sierra Leone through to running our clinic in a variety of other countries, and then eventually ended up being on defense teams in Cambodia for the folks who committed the massacres there under Pol Pot's regime, and even in former Yugoslavia, focusing on the war criminals who were being tried in The Hague for those terrible crimes. And all of this was really about trying to prevent another Holocaust. My mother was the daughter of Holocaust survivors, and that had really shaped her life. And I was seeing Rwanda and other things happen at the end of high school and beginning of undergrad, and thought that my means of changing the world, of fixing things and making amends. I got really frustrated at those tribunals. I clerked at the Supreme Court of Israel with the fact that political realities were getting in the way. On paper, what in law should have been really positive trials that led to both prosecutions and reconciliation. In the end, in many of these countries, it actually led to more conflict than reconciliation. In Cambodia, the population was very explicitly anti the existence of the tribunal. Certainly the current government and its leadership back then was as well. I found myself in these really uncomfortable situations where on paper things looked great, but the reality wasn't actually making things better. In some cases, it was even making them worse. I dramatically switched gears. I came back to Canada. I became an IP lawyer. From IP law, I transitioned out of law completely, confirming I am not a great lawyer. I'm not detail oriented and I'm not adversarial. That really was the transition to tech and set me on a path to working with you. Most specifically, and maybe I'll end the pre story with this. Most specifically, the IP law experience I had was usually lobbying for pharma or litigating for patent troll, teaching me about how the economy works, but still not working for the people I wanted to or creating the kind of change I wanted. And yet I kept sending leads to local software development shops whenever one of my intellectual property law tech clients also needed to build an app or a website or needed design help. One of my regular referees turned back to me and said, Jake, we know you're leaving law. You've been sending us enough deals. Just keep sending us the deals and we can start a company together. And that turned out not just to be a software development shop, but because of our experience at another software boot camp, which we were unimpressed with in terms of its quality of education and scale, we actually ended up founding Canada's largest software boot camp, Lighthouse Labs, to sort of fill the gap in developers that we couldn't hire either domestically or overseas. And that really set me on the path to my current work in sort of at that intersection of education and technology.
And Lighthouse, is it both B2C or is it also B2B or
All three.
what's the model? All three.
B2G, B2C, and B2B. It started out being exclusively B2C. So it started out being a boot camp that people would pay for 9-week course and was very focused on software development. Over the years, like so many boot camps, has really expanded its mandate. And so ended up teaching everything from cybersecurity to AI skills, data science skills, et cetera. More recently, as a result of large amounts of Canadian government dollars going into employment services, going into try to fix and fill skills gaps in the economy, focused on the areas I just described, many of our students are now government subsidized. So instead of paying their own way, it's actually the government that's paying for them to go through these programs. In that respect, we're B2G. And then finally, there are a number of companies that we partner with often who sort of would hire our grads and then wanted us to help them with training within their corporations who are our B2B corporate clients.
I think the bootcamp space is so fascinating because it's obviously so needed, but the whole industry's gone through this arc, right? As universities have adapted somewhat, and there's been this huge demand for software developers, but now that's pared back a bit on the junior level, but still doesn't feel like the universities are taking up enough of the model as what I would have expected 10 years ago.
100%. That is where I thought the change would be. I thought the long-term impact that we were going to have was not just training these students and filling these skills gaps, which almost by necessity was a time and place kind of change in the sense that once you fill the skills gap, hypothetically, the system should adjust and or as technology evolves, the skills needed by our economies change pretty dramatically. So what the bootcamp was training before might no longer be necessary, as I think was the case with junior software development. But instead of having the impact there, we thought it was actually going to be on public post-secondary systems. So I spent much of my time after having left Lighthouse, including with LinkedIn, focused on conversations with the leaders of education systems, with policymakers, with investors in education across the US and Canada, thinking about how we could take that bootcamp model, which really did solve the skills gap specifically. And I'll give maybe one example of it after I finish this story, but how we could take those lessons and, as you said, imbue them into the much, much larger public education systems in Canada and public and private education systems in the US. And a shockingly small number of schools have managed to integrate boot camps well. We've seen the stories of Trilogy and many other boot camps that were bought by post-secondaries, and they tried to integrate them, and many are still operating, but I don't know very many that continue to make a profit or really sort of seen as models within their post-secondaries. And yet, in my mind, the ideal would have actually just been that every college and university in the world, certainly in North America, creates shorter term micro-credential type programs that are a matter of weeks and that ladder up to their certificates and degrees where necessary, but which also can be used on their own to, as you said, educate somebody in a corporation or on the job, to educate somebody who's recently been laid off, or is just wants to change careers, much in the way that a boot camp would, but with the existing and much greater resources of the post-secondary system. So yeah, I'm really, really shocked that post-secondaries haven't been able to adapt enough, with a few obvious examples like ASU, which obviously jumps on almost every sort of new idea in a really agile and sometimes effective manner. Um, and I think the only thing I can explain that lack of a transition or transformation is the ongoing calcification of higher ed. Like the fact that MOOCs didn't shock higher ed out of its intransigence, and then that COVID and Zoo didn't in turn change how what is perhaps the hardest to move industry in the world operates, suggests to me that we're going to have to change something more fundamental, like tenure track structures and sort of how courses are structured, if we are ever going to sort of save higher ed from what seems like a slow but inevitable decline.
I mean, how do you think about the like government is still still gives significant funding to higher ed, in the US, Title IV funding still go like boot camps don't get any of this like subsidized Title IV funding, but like universities that have poor
Colleges.
outcomes, colleges still certainly do. And then there's still there's just the cultural narrative, the rite of passage of going to like the 4-year degree program. I mean, in the US, the sports is like, well, don't you wanna be part of a sorority and, like, go
Um,
to, like, root on your college high school or sorry, your college football team? Like, I mean, how do we kinda, like, get to that level of pragmatism? And it just seems like people just don't want it.
I completely agree. I mean, part of it has to start with employers. We are still using the short form of a degree or certificate to qualify the vast majority of jobs. And I think the signals that the many states that have already moved to skills based hiring are sending, that at least at the state level, they will not exclusively rely on certificates and degrees, but instead, for many roles, will instead focus on the skills and the potential of the individual. Those are fantastic signals. But there is still a tiny number of employers who are implementing that. And Burning Glass Institute showed that even for those states who have been doing it for a while, the impact on the diversity of candidates actually getting through the funnel was still very, very, very limited. We're talking like under 1%. And that was largely because of culture and behavior. So what we really have to change, to your point, is how people think about the entire pipeline from education to employment, and valuing people for their skills throughout that pipeline in a way that overcomes a lot of the biases that are so baked into a society that really does still think everybody needs a degree, when certainly in the US, that's just not possible. Half of Americans aren't finishing their community college certificates. And as you pointed out, those CCs in many cases are actually returning a negative ROI, right? They are hampering people's careers instead of helping them, despite getting public dollars to do so. And the political pressures to change that remain mixed. Biden and this current administration tried really hard to reform how community college is paid for in America, and the CCs themselves got in the way, let alone many other actors who were pushing against it. So I think it is a really tricky system, but I do, with all of that sort of negative baggage, still think, for instance, that boot camps, that MOOCs, that ed tech, and innovations in sort of educational processes have already made a really positive impact on America and in Canada. And even contrasting those two systems is helpful, because up in Canada, we have a largely public system where tons of schools now do have boot camp like programming, micro credential like offerings. And while most are pretty nascent, my favorite examples are a few that actually, I think, for instance, here in Toronto, are working really well. Um, we used LinkedIn data about 5 years ago to compare the most in-demand jobs in Toronto with what requirements from a skills perspective you could satisfy just in the length of a boot camp. So these had to be jobs that you could train people for very quickly, but were also very in demand. And the example I always use is Adobe Flash skills. Back in the time when like half of the internet was built using Flash, the most in demand skills were the Adobe software skills used to build Flash. Dreamweaver. I can't remember what the software was called, but what happened overnight is Apple made Flash obsolete by preventing it from running on iOS. And what was literally the most in-demand technical skill set in Toronto stopped being useful in any way overnight. And so for public post-secondaries where it takes 4 or 5 years to get the government to approve a program, which it's funding, to have to change what you're teaching every year or 2 years, because that's how fast the technology or the economy is changing, is extremely hard. And boot camps were the answer to that, which more and more post-secondaries are adopting as a means of getting around some of that imbalance between the speed of government and the speed of tech.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny to just talk about those speeds because I read a funny tweet that was like aerospace engineering, we make a new plane every 25 years. Civil engineering, we build a new bridge every decade. Software engineering, have you switched to Snark yet? It came out on Monday.
100%. And
Did
there's
you
probably
upgrade to
products,
Perplexity yet? I mean, it's even
complexity,
going
exactly.
faster, right?
Totally. And I think there's probably problems with both of those extremes, right? Like if we are building artificial intelligence systems that, as OpenAI aspires to, will eventually get to AGI in the not too distant future, well, that's at least as dangerous as a bridge falling or, um, some of these sort of core engineering challenges, or a fighter jet crashing into a building. And yet, because we categorize it as software and because we have the energy of the investment industry behind it at a different sort of speed and even these days to a different dimension, we don't have the same safety checks that we have on building bridges. And I think that's highly problematic. I think one of the benefits actually of being up here in Canada and spending a lot of my time working in the States, just in the past few weeks, I've had the lucky opportunity to advise the White House twice and a variety of members of Congress. And in those conversations, I am bringing the lessons from a country where Yoshua Bengio, where Geoffrey Hinton, two of the inventors of large language models, have really devoted their the remainder of their careers to focusing attention on the safety needs associated with artificial intelligence, not just the speed with which it can be built, because they think we could all kill ourselves, and even in the shorter term, we could be devoting these massive amounts of dollars and energy to purposes that are not good for society as a whole, rather are just good for a limited subset of society or certain companies. And I think that they are rightly asking that, like bridges, like major military investments in the next fighter jet, we think about how we should be directing these investments in these technologies.
What do you think about the risks of de-skilling as technology does more and more of our jobs for us? And we saw this with airplanes, right? Like, should airplanes fly themselves? Now most pilots are actually like flying the plane
Yeah.
such a minuscule amount of time, and you normally
Yeah.
actually that's good, right? But then in the very like the 0.1% where you actually do need some human intervention, then it requires a pilot to both A, know this is the very rare instance when they need to intervene, and then B, do the right thing during that intervention.
Yeah.
Um,
I don't think what people keep struggling with in this case is whether it's different from any other kind of technology.
yeah,
And from the pace of change, which
yeah.
I again argue is within our control, the fact that we're just accepting massive global changing technologies without some of the safeguards is we have agency over that. We don't have to be sort of moving forward at the same pace. But I like your question about de-skilling in particular because it has come up with every single technological evolution in history. The classic example is elevators, right?
Mm,
For the longest time, we had people in elevators well after they served no purpose other than to reassure us in that 1 in 1,000 example where it got stuck. And now we have a way of communicating with people outside the elevator. So the worst thing that happens is once every couple of years, we all get stuck in an elevator and then somebody
yeah.
opens it up. And obviously, it's slightly different in a fighter jet or with artificial general intelligence. But practically, I actually think you could build in safeguards to result in almost identical scenarios. And we haven't necessarily done that with AI yet, but I think we will. I think
Mhm.
those skills, which, for instance, it used to be that we needed way more junior software developers. Now the AI is helping us develop software at 20% Gen AI is helping us develop it 20% more efficiently. And we've got that's like the best studies on the impact of Gen AI on skills right now are all related to coding.
Yeah.
Because in almost every other field, we're seeing both pros and cons to the addition of Gen AI to other skill sets. But in coding, sure, it's making it more efficient. The result is that it's moving the um, choke points further up the pipeline. So now developers are spending less time, but still a significant amount of time on code review instead of originally writing the code, which is being
Mm.
done with Gen AI much faster. And the result is that, sure, they're probably going to lose some of their abilities to code the original code because the Gen AI is doing it. But that review requires higher level skills, which are perhaps more important to those individuals and to society. And so we're sort of saving ourselves from doing some of the things that the ATM does. But now we are having conversations with financial advisors as opposed to with clerks who only knew how to deposit a check. And those clerks have been trained in the additional skills to make them financial advisors. So getting back to the example of Gen AI, I really do think that what we have to do is leverage these technologies to enable us to focus more on skills further up Maslow's hierarchy. A great example, in my opinion, comes from the world of advertising agencies. Everybody was worried when Gen AI came out that all of a sudden, no, we weren't going to need marketers anymore because you could simply prompt the advertisement and then it would create the video. And the response from, I think, the smartest advertisers was, our contribution is not the ability to do graphic design or to write brilliant copy. Rather, it's the creativity in coming up with the idea that is necessary to do the prompts, to write the prompts. And if you can spend more time prompting, if you can spend more time on the creative aspects of creating an advertisement or a film, then potentially that actually opens us up to higher level thinking, more higher level thinking, rather than de-skilling, to use your word.
And in that world, how do you measure skills? Like you wrote an article recently about how um you know credentials, like traditional credentials, are becoming obsolete, and digital verification of skills will be like the next frontier. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, and what does that look like you know
Yeah,
in
it's a great
reality?
because that article I think I originally wrote it 4 or 5 years ago, and it holds true to this day, but it's happening much more slowly than I originally thought for reasons that we already covered in terms of the calcification of higher education and government slow moving, and the fact that people are resistant to change in a really deep seated way that I think folks in tech or even in policy often underestimate. So, a classic example related to AI, and then I'll get to your specific question about credentialing and measuring skills, is what shut down a lot of the efforts to move EV manufacturing, electric vehicle manufacturing, and self driving trucking forward about 5, 10 years ago in the sort of the last hype cycle for AI. What ended a lot of that enthusiasm was huge movements amongst unions, amongst trucking industry to put pressure on Congress and others to slow down what was happening in the self-driving and electric vehicle worlds because they were worried about what in a majority of US states, and this has been the case for a very long time, the most in-demand job, or at least the job that the most people are in, is trucking. And so all of those folks who are truckers were pushing, and their stakeholders, their lobbyists, et cetera, were pushing back on the potential that tech could get rid of, unlikely, I would say, or at least change dramatically their jobs. Um, and I do think so this is why the skilling and credentialing progress, the getting away from degrees and certificates and moving to more agile ways of both assessing skills and teaching them. The reason it's happening so slowly is in large part, in my opinion, because of that human intransigence, that uh, hesitation to change, which is, as we talked about, present not just in higher ed and government, but also in companies, trucking companies who aren't willing to take that leap to a self-driving truck or an electric truck. Um, and yet, I do think we're seeing more and more and more, particularly in places that have high inequality like America, more and more individuals who are learning skills on their own online or from alternative forms of education like bootcamps, et cetera, that are learning via micro credentials, so often through shorter forms of education that can be laddered up into either certificates or degrees. Even if they can't, it doesn't matter. At a minimum, they're connecting them to the labor market more quickly than spending 4 years in post-secondary would look like. And a generally greater acceptance by the students, not always their parents, but certainly the next generation after ours, that there will be other pathways to those jobs than through a public post-secondary, and that the skills they're learning either on the job, like the rise in work integrated learning and work-based learning cannot be understated. And I think Ryan Craig and his whole apprenticeship movement is a really important movement, albeit a little self-interested. That I think that those alternative pathways are becoming more and more and more important and will continue to. Um, and maybe
On this, what
definitely
are you seeing on the employer side in terms of them being able to access and interpret micro credentials? Because I always just find that, like, they often become overwhelmed or, and then there's, like, the AI wars, right? Like, everyone's using AI to, like, do their resume and their credentials and their LinkedIn, but then the recruiters are all using AI to,
that doesn't mind. But let's use those as two separate points. So
yeah, okay.
first point, I think you have an increasing number. It's not just tech now, it's also the banks and sort of the smartest, most well-resourced, and most agile employers who are all um, moving quite fast towards all of these alternative pathways because they realize for their own business's sake, they need to expand the talent pool, whether it's for a greater diversity of employees or just in the tightest labor market in history, getting enough employees requires that they go beyond certificates and degrees. So in that respect, I think we have a growing sector. The AI race is a really fascinating one on recruiting because in this respect, the folks applying for the jobs for the first time have an advantage that the tech, in my opinion, hasn't entirely caught up to. And so for most of recent history, re- uh, recruiting software, applicant tracking systems, a variety of HR systems that particularly large employers were able to um, leverage to get much greater efficiency in their hiring processes, perhaps less effectiveness, because I think it often ended up in forms of discrimination and oversight that actually damaged the companies. But at a minimum, they could accept and review thousands times as many applications as they could before because there was literally AI reviewing it well before Gen AI. Um, and then humans reviewing a much, much smaller subset of the applications. That obviously has flipped now with a huge number of people being able to apply to far more jobs using Gen AI than they would have been able to write by hand beforehand. So I think that has flipped the dynamic in a really big way. And it'll be interesting to see how employing AI to read AI applications, how that works. Because as an example, we know when you train language models on AI generated data, they actually get worse. And my expectation is the same rules will begin to apply as applicant tracking systems are trying to differentiate between many human plus AI generated applications. You're going to get both worse applications and you're going to get worse results in trying to review those applications. So we are hitting a sort of a critical limit in the benefits of this technology already. But I also think two things are going to happen. There's going to be an increasing number of employers who say, we don't want you to use AI in your application. And there's just another story today about ChatGPT having a tool that can prevent or detect to a 99 point something percent accuracy any Gen AI in writing, which could have been used, for instance, by teachers to prevent cheating, but which they haven't released for one reason or another. And there's tons of speculation as to why. And I think that this arms race is partly why they haven't released it. They're worried that it's going to really change the dynamic that they, of course, are really controlling in terms of how Gen AI is used. So one side is employers are just not going to accept Gen AI created applications. The other interesting one, though, is we're going to get to this place where it does facilitate higher level skills, like we were saying before about pilots. So it'll be interesting when my ability to think about how to prompt an AI to match my career to a particular job will result in a more interesting and effective, and perhaps eventually, if we're doing it in real time, even interactive application process than we've dreamed up as of yet. And I sort of look forward to the day when we no longer have resumes and cover letters, but rather we have some advanced form of LinkedIn and Neuralink, which is connecting me to perhaps not even the recruiter, but just directly the hiring manager, because we don't need as many intermediaries, technological or human, in the process.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, one of the questions I have for this, I mean, you already hit on the need. Feel like the key skill in the knowledge economy is going to be creativity, because then it like that's an endless like source, and the bar for that keeps on going up. But is the other C that I like to talk about on the like lower skill side technically has been caring, right?
Mm,
Because we're going to need a lot of with an aging population, you need a lot of caregivers, and then you also, for the younger generation, need, childcare
out there.
teachers, early childhood educators, which, by the way, like, most young kids don't want like screen time. They can only do so much screen time. They need to spend time in person and around adults.
100%. I completely agree. And I think the bans from, that are rapidly spreading across school boards, certainly up here in Canada, and I think eventually in the States as well, for cell phones, for social media, et cetera, are an indication that there is a growing realization, Jonathan Haidt, et cetera, of how bad technology in its current form is for most kids and for most early education. But I think let's expand on this care economy conversation, because I think you're right. I mean, you probably intentionally described care-related skills as lower skills, and I think that is perhaps the biggest failing in our economy as of
Mhm.
yet, is that the combination of finance and technology has meant that we associate technical skills with high-level skills and human skills with low-level skills. So substitute soft, essential, whatever on the human side, right? There's various words to describe it, but I sort of like the more general description of human skills. And then technical skills is anything that, for instance, you could be objectively tested on, which also means that a computer applicant tracking system, AI, is going to be way better, at least in its current form, at measuring the technical skills than the human skills, which is also why we rank them more highly. And that, from a social or even an economic efficiency perspective, doesn't make sense, right? The easiest skill to test shouldn't be the skill that we rank most highly, but because of how everything from education to our employers' technologies are structured, that has long been the case. And as a result of that, plus the fact that you can actually make more money off of the technical skills than the human skills, certainly that's how our economy has been crafted, um, you have this massive devaluing of the skills that AI is making more important by the day, and that I think to human meaningfulness and happiness and culture, to really the history of humanity, those are the skills that are more important. And you could probably expand from the care economy, which, as you described it, is skills associated with people taking care of people or people interacting with people, the hardest skills to teach, the hardest skills to measure. You could expand from that, really, I would argue, into anything that is humanities related, arts related, et cetera, because they all require, as you said, a degree of human creativity, which as of yet, thankfully, AI cannot replicate. And because those are the things that give life meaning, right? Like learning gives meaning, and it could be a technical skill or a human skill, but you really need the human side of the equation to have a complete life, in my opinion. And our economy is not just undervaluing it. In some cases, it's not valuing it at all. And so I haven't really figured out how to create that sea change. I know there are a lot of voices arguing for it. But I think that if there was one overarching recommendation I could make to policymakers as they think about their investments in things like AI, it would be to value the care economy and find ways to make those investments to support those in the care economy rather than coders and other folks who have amazing technical skills.
Well, I agree with everything what you say, but I think the nuance on the like high technical side is that you have
Mhm.
to pair your technical skills with creativity, which is why,
Right.
like, these AI engineers at OpenAI might make $1 million a year, but your junior coder is it basically out of a job, right? Because the lower end technical careers have now just been replaced by automated technology tools. And
Yeah,
so
I think it's
like, yeah.
I saw Kasparov, the great chess player, give an amazing talk about a decade ago, maybe 8 years, and he was very frustrated at this point with a previous conflict with Ukraine because, the Russians had first kicked him out of the country, right? Because he was fighting with Putin, then, chased him out of Ukraine because he was supporting the Ukrainian government, and then he had just gotten beat by, for the first time in history, a computer, as a great chess player. And what he described was learning that not only was there sort of a longer term play vis-a-vis the Russian government, Ukrainians, et cetera, but more importantly, vis-a-vis technology, he had discovered that if he can play with tech, if he can learn how to work with the computer, he'll be able to beat, and this is true to this day, every other computer. So the key is human plus machine is stronger than either human or machine under almost any circumstance that we've ever come across yet. And that is, as you said, the message. You need those human skills because they're the ones that you can combine with the technical skills to allow us to engage with machines in a manner that is more efficient than any machine. And I think that's sort of the check on artificial general intelligence that a lot of folks think we need to keep, which is our ability to control the machines, and to sort of allow for that control. We need the skills to both be creative and sort of human in our thinking and technically interact with the computers.
One of the great Michael Fullen, the Toronto educationalist, used to say, "A fool with a tool is still a fool."
Great line. Fantastic line. Yeah, it's so true. And I think we give too much credit to fools who make a lot of money or have a lot of power, but because in part they have really powerful tools, rather than those who are quieter with less powerful tools, but who are using them, for instance, to take care of people in ways that dramatically positively impact those people's lives.
Yeah.
So we've been really general. I feel like we have to get a little more specific. And in particular, I thought to jump into a couple examples of the startups that I've been advising that use AI in order to facilitate the care economy, and who I think in a really smart manner have been getting away from the emphasis on AI, even if it is right at the core of powering their products, and instead have been emphasizing the human skills to engage with it. So as an example, HireGuide is a company I advise that um, involves a Gen AI recording while you're doing an interview to give you feedback on how your interview is going, whether you're asking questions that are biased, that relate to your history rather than the potential of the person you're interviewing, or whether you are, and then it's green light, keep going, asking skills-based questions that relate to their potential to perform in the role. So that real-time feedback used to be the core of the product. And what they discovered over the past few years is the training for interviewers about bias, the guides for what kinds of questions they should be asking across different fields, and the AI being an assistant, but never the sort of decision maker, rather always being behind the scenes and particularly helping the applicant, not the reviewer, that ends up both in better interviews and better hires. And so the emphasis moved from the AI being at the core to the AI being an assistant, augmented intelligence instead of artificial intelligence, as so many folks are saying, with these educational aspects and checklists on the human behavior becoming much, much more important. And I think that I'm seeing that happen over and over again, where AI was championed as the special sauce in a startup. And in the end, it was actually their expertise around human interaction that allowed them to succeed, with AI simply enabling it like another tool.
What's another example of that?
Great question. Um, So a lot of the work that I've been doing these days is in, and we've actually had some conversations about startups in this space about exams and sort of how to test human skills. uh,
Yeah.
or, or more easily technical skills. Um, and on the human skills testing side, what I think has become really, really clear is if we can facilitate human conversation in a manner that allows humans to see those human skills without exclusively identifying them with their own personalities or selves, that's actually a really useful function for AI. So, for instance, for teachers evaluating their students, particularly early in their education, if the AI can flag when, again, the teacher is bringing in their own biases or is being overly focused on either technical or human skills for that matter, it can actually help with the human assessment as long as it leaves the final assessment still to the human. Um, here's another really fun example where we're using AI, Gen AI in particular, in a manner, or actually, this is using large language models in a manner that has transformed Canada's economy. So, the two largest Series Bs in Canada's history both just occurred in the past 2 months. One of them is in the law tech space, and one of them is in the self driving car space. And in both cases, they are very much examples of augmented intelligence instead of artificial intelligence. So in the law tech case, Clio is a software company that focuses much more on increasing efficiency in the many tasks lawyers have to do other than drafting, litigating, et cetera. So it's not actually their core work, although of course there are many law tech startups that do focus on that. Um, and Gen AI has actually helped with all of those ancillary tasks, I would argue, at least as much as it has with the core of content creation for lawyers. In fact, much of the controversy in law revolves around that second category where lawyers are just having Gen AI write it for them, and we can't get past this issue with hallucination at such a rate that it's really not adding a ton of value. On the other side is the self-driving car phenomenon, where we as humans still are pushing back on something that every statistic would suggest will save lives and make the world a better place, right? Every study says we should have self-driving cars because they will just, even in their current imperfect form, be so much better than us at driving, even on roads that they haven't fully tested, they'll save lives. Despite all that, they aren't coming in for the exact same reasons we were talking about earlier: human intransigence, unwillingness to change, even some of our sort of moral qualms with technology taking over, which is, I think, doubly ironic as we speed up development towards AGI by companies like OpenAI. So that's on the one side. But this company, Waabi, WAABI, has figured out how to run self-driving car systems, how to test them against LLMs instead of in the real world. So they take the LiDAR and the radar and all the stuff that sits on top of those crazy cars that are driving around. And instead of testing it on a car driving around a city, they take all of the recordings from those previous drives. They take a bunch of other public data out there, open maps, et cetera, and then they plug it into an LLM, which goes back and forth with the self-driving car system to test out scenarios at a far faster rate and with far more diversity than one could ever do in the real world. And the result, they say, is they're actually advancing the safety of self-driving cars far faster than ever before. And the reason I think that's important is because the advances there are happening where it's like a technical meets technical advance moving ahead, while we in the real world reckon with the human moral consequences or questions associated with this dramatic advance. And so it's helping us. The fact that the tech is getting better on its own and faster is actually helping us deal with some of the moral qualms that continue to kill people because we won't let self-driving cars on the road. And so there you can see sort of two very different examples of where Gen AI isn't actually tackling what we thought was going to be the core of the problem. It's on the periphery, but it's dramatically advancing law in one case and self-driving cars in another.
Yeah, that is like a real fascinating area of technology that's just bounding ahead. Um on the sort of similar vein but a bit different, you recently um I think we're a co-organizer of the Equitable Tech Summit in DC. Uh, at Avalanche, we invest in companies that transform how people learn, earn, and own. And ownership is a big part of that, was a big part of that Equitable Tech Summit. And, the traditionally, the ownership economy, people kind of like associated that with Web3 and blockchain. but, like, it kind of went through its ups and downs with the amount of, fraud and misaligned incentives that saw in 2021 and 2022. What what were the sort of, like, vibes and big ideas coming out of Equitable Tech? Like, what gets you excited about that space going forward?
It was one of the more mind-opening conferences of my life, and I attend a conference every few days these days, speak at one once a week. And so it really was a life-changing conference in a few different ways. One, the format was fantastic. So for those who organize conferences, what I would highly recommend taking from this is a bunch of very short speeches. It doesn't take much usually to get the core point or project that you've been working on across. So I think in this case, it was, 2 sets of 10 speeches, each 6 minutes long, and I was the timekeeper for half of those, so I really had to be, getting up there at the 5-minute mark. But in that respect, it harkens back to this line where, Y Combinator recently, I think, reduced the number of minutes for its interviews from 20 to 10 minutes, when there was this huge shock from the startup community that there was no way they could convey their ideas in 10 minutes. The guys at YC were like, women and men were like, we actually come up with our decisions in 2 minutes usually. So the other 18 minutes are actually useless. The fact that you're down to 10 is a good signal to you that you really got to connect in the first minute or two. Otherwise, you're sort of lost. And I think that's a really important message for folks as a whole. It actually harkens again back to the emotional connection importance, because in those first 2 minutes, you're probably not getting all the ideas across, but you are persuading them, whether the investor, whether or not what you're talking about. Jumping back to the Equitable Tech Summit, um, bunch of short presentations and then round tables that are extremely orchestrated, where each person, like at a wedding, is chosen because of who they're sitting next to and sitting across from, et cetera, to talk about one or some of the topics up there, but tying it back to what each individual is bringing to the table. So something that they need or something that they contribute to that idea, et cetera. And what happened was people got to know each other really fast around substantive content that then they continued to work on in terms of, I've got 3 projects that came out of that conference that I'm still planning on continuing. So that was the format. Now, in terms of the substance, one of my favorite examples is you had a woman who created the largest freelancers union in the world, and then went on to chair the New York Federal Reserve, and then came back to running a freelancers union.
Wait, what
And
was it called?
it was a freelancers union.
Oh, yeah, but what was the freelancer union called? It was just
Like
called the
all
free oh, the
I think it's
freelancers
all
union.
about
Alright.
freelancers.
Wow.
And she was a remarkable person because she captured this zeitgeist in the room where it was some combination of the place where cooperative type ownership models and libertarian type thinking meets is really that place in the political spectrum where the full circle comes around. And people were able to sort of slide around that political spectrum very fluidly, as long as they all kept this consensus around values such as we need a America that is more equal, that sticks together instead of being as polarized as it is, um, and that is all about building a better future for its citizens, rather than the sort of many other interests which it described as tearing apart the country. And so, for instance, the use of blockchain to create alternative, both financial incentives, but the stuff I was more interested in is the ongoing conversations that really came to the fore with DAOs around new forms of organization. There is zero reason why all of our companies should still be structured in the military hierarchy. And the combination of DAOs on chain and off have facilitated a ton of thinking about new forms of organizational structure, which I think have actually changed already how a lot of businesses operate, right? Like you have these massively distributed businesses like Asana or the creators of WordPress, et cetera, that operate in entirely asynchronous, distributed fashions, which again, in some cases have a hierarchy, in other cases don't, but wouldn't have been possible without this technology. And so getting into sort of what the next stage of companies like that, of organizations, of governments like that looks like, was really inspiring for me. And the fact that you had the actual decision makers in the room, you had representatives from Congress, you had former FTC chairs, et cetera. They were the decision makers. They know which of these pie in the sky ideas are actually going to infiltrate government and corporations and change how they operate, and which will stay sort of relegated to the history of technology. And so it felt like some of the ideas in that room were actually going to change the world in ways that I was excited about. I can't hear you, Caitlin, and that might be my fault. Let
No,
me
no, it's
figure.
me. Do you think there's any venture opportunity there?
Yeah, I do. It's a tricky one in my opinion because I think GovTech is as challenging to invest in as governments are to sell into.
Mm.
Um, that the scale of the benefit and sometimes the returns can also be commensurate with that difficulty. So I'll give some examples. Um, I think if we are to change how people vote, it will really dramatically change how America works. But to get people to be excited about quadratic voting and polling systems that operate at scale and in real time, where, for instance, my favorite example is this tool called Polis, that whether in Taiwan or in Ireland has been able to engage tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of citizens in an active conversation online using short messaging about a subject that has been very polarizing, let's say abortion in Ireland, and which then allows via text message them to build a consensus around people's views and values on that subject, which then can be used by government to create new laws or to invest differently, et cetera. So I'll use another example. We are running an experiment where we're going to test a bunch of these technologies for real-time education and engagement with individuals on political subjects focused on AI regulation and investment. Governments can't figure out from their own citizens how scared they are of AI versus how excited they are to invest in it. But if we can give them the AI-based tools to engage with those citizens in real time, they'll be able to make smarter, maybe even larger investments into these technologies, which in turn could benefit the folks building those technologies. So there's like a nicely circular piece here. And the last example I'll give is really specific to LLMs and Gen AI. Polis, this technology, this others, Remesh, et cetera. The output of it, after you have all these conversations facilitated with folks across tens of thousands of people, the output are quantitative values, right? They're words perhaps, but they're in digital form. And so Anthropic used that output as the input into the constitution for its latest version of Claude, which meant that it was able to poll huge swaths of the population, a representative percentage of the population, take their values and use those values to structure what its large language model, how it works, what it's allowed to do, what it's not allowed to do, what it's allowed to say, what it's not allowed to say. You could take the exact same values and have them as an input into this government laws and regulations of AI. And so you get what Lawrence Lessig talked about so many years ago, code as law. You get our values, human values, most importantly, at the very top, controlling how the AI works technologically and legally. And that symmetry, I think, is going to be really important as we move forward, trying to ensure that that humans stay in the loop at the most important levels, which is to say the decision making about our technology.
Okay. Um,
That was technical, sorry.
no, that was good. I mean, it's just amazing to see. It'll be really interesting over the next 10 years to see this come to fruition in its various forms because people are really pioneering interesting models that bring together culture, technology, and government together. But manifesting it in a model that scales is still like
Super
TBD.
hard, super
And
hard. I mean,
yeah, there's
Taiwan in America as of yet. But I do think it's worth looking, for instance, at these exceptional small country-sized examples, because another example from Taiwan, one of their foremost partners as a result of these conversations is the Ethereum Foundation. And that means the country working with a foundation almost as an equal because, for instance, Taiwan has been isolated by China from many other country to country relationships. But that isolation is actually resulting, in my opinion, in innovations in terms of how companies and countries can work in the future, foundations can work in the future, because all of a sudden you have a non-state actor that was the result of innovations in technology, the Ethereum Foundation, which also has now got a very large community supporting it, a lot of cash, and strong views and values on how it thinks its technology and others should be used. partnering with a country that is instrumental in so many different geopolitical and technological conversations, right? They're the largest suppliers of chips, as an example. Um, and the result of that partnership is a literal new form of government to corporate interaction that could be a model for other companies moving forward.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it rolls out and scales. I mean, part of it has been that, these coins have become so valuable so quickly that there's so much economic power in these chains. And so of course, like it's not any old foundation that's like funded by philanthropy. It's, it what is the market cap of Ethereum these days? Like $1 trillion, so, it's definitely larger than some African countries. But
Sure.
we are coming up on an hour, and I want to make sure that we get to our podcast question. So, question for you, Jake, is what do you think? And I know that you have so many views across so many different sectors, but if you had to pick one thing that you think is obviously the future that others might not see, what would that be? What's obvious to you, but not obvious to most people that you spend time with?
I like the one that we touched on earlier, and maybe we can explore it in a little bit more depth, but it is 100% the idea, and maybe you can repeat the quote that you used earlier about it's the human plus the machine, not the human versus or the machine. I think that is very much going to be the case, and it is going to be the people that crack that nut, the people, the companies, the governments that are able to figure out human to computer interaction better, that will actually be the most influential and successful organizations and individuals moving forward. So I think that it's really hard to overstate its importance. And there are extremes, thinking about Neuralink, but I actually think the more mundane examples are often the more telling. So if when we went from handwriting to cursive, there was a huge outcry that we were like losing a skill. Or from when I went from cursive to typing, there was this huge outcry, to your point about de-skilling, that we were losing something essential to human thinking and creativity. Because literally, you think differently when you write in cursive than when you don't. Um, those outcries eventually were quelled and perhaps even sort of overwritten by the consensus that we were able to communicate faster, more effectively, et cetera, by typing than by writing. And I think the same is going to be true for Gen AI and for other technologies. But what we can't forget, and what is becoming increasingly important as the pace of technological change and the scale of its impact on humanity increases, is that we have agency over the technology. That seems to be forgotten. And so there's this link between the fact that it's the human plus the tech that's more powerful than just the tech, and the fact that humans have to remember that they have agency over the tech in order to use it, not just most effectively, but perhaps most socially responsibly in a way that like is actually best for ourselves as well. That connection is one that I would say should be the takeaway from this podcast.
Well, I of course love that take, and I'm like fully on board. In another conversation, we'll have to talk about this idea of lossless collaboration because I think people are beginning to really innovate on that. But it's more of a theory than it is.
Everything, right? Like what can you do if every interaction you've ever had with a person is there, is sort of somehow
Yeah.
being and you can access all of it. I have, if anybody, here's a request to your audience.
Okay.
I have notes in text documents since I was 12 years old. I was the geekiest kid in high school with a Palm Pilot and a fold-out keyboard, and every note I've ever taken is in a .txt file in one big folder, which is sort of scary
Wow.
because it's probably got a lot of personally identifiable information and other stuff. But because it's all .txt, it's also a relatively small folder with tens of thousands of documents in it. And what I would love is to be able to interact with it like an LLM, as if it was my own personal LLM, which is, I think, the sort of stereotypical take the enterprise use case of Gen AI that very few have actually figured out, and then just apply it to an individual. In my case, my history and data. And yet, I have not found anyone who can guarantee the level of privacy and security for documents that contain all sorts of very private information. Um, where I would trust it to add these. And so I've sort of gotten halfway there with a few different friends and their companies who rely on mainstream Gen AI APIs. And again, haven't been sufficiently reassured. So if anybody does have an answer to that burning problem, I would be hyper grateful and happy to share some of the learnings.
I might have one for you, but I want to finish this interview first. So last question for you. What is a book that you'd recommend to your younger self?
It's funny because I, in the past, would always recommend The Count of Monte Cristo.
Interesting.
Um, I thought it was such an incredible story of sort of Machiavellian perseverance and retribution um, and was just like a masterful story in and of itself. And the ability to tell a wonderful story, I think, is as important. But more recently, I've been super caught up in Neil Stephenson's world. One of the ideas that I have for how to save ourselves from ourselves is to get folks like Neil Stephenson and Margaret Atwood, who have been extremely effective at predicting the short-term future, but always in a dystopian manner. They're always predicting how we're going to make the world worse, not better. And I want to get them together, use that same tool we were talking about earlier, like Polis, where we seek values on a variety of issues, like you would for a political platform, and then have the two of them or a few others write a positive narrative, a utopia instead of a dystopia, grounded in the actual values of a population, which a government or company can then use as the basis for its work. Because governments, companies tend to be hyper reactive. We never think ahead at the world we want. They also are as negative as these sci-fi authors. And the result is we keep creating worlds that look worse than the ones that we would want to live in. And I think if instead you could have sci-fi authors write a better version of the future, narratives are much more compelling than nonfiction for most people. And then you had a political leader or a company leverage that narrative to actually build what these sci-fi authors had dreamed up in a better future based on our values, that could actually provide much better sense of direction for society or the company. So that's not a book, but it's an idea for one.
Well, I that really fits with other members that have come on the podcast, including Damian Walker or Walter, who runs the largest science fiction community on the internet.
Wow. I gotta
So
go.
yeah, yeah, that is been very well. Well, Jake, thank you so much for your time today, for your insights, for sharing with us like the future of skills, credentialing, equitable tech. Like it's an exciting future. It's great to be in the arena building it with you and our community of founders. So
Pleasure.
thank
Thanks
you.
for